Hi, everybody. Welcome back to what I believe is episode 6. Is it episode 6, Adam?
Yeah.
Episode 6 of Kvetching with Adam and Jarrod. Still a low budget Jewish production, hopefully working up towards a middle budget Jewish production within the next few episodes. But that might be more of a dream than a reality. It's been a very tough week for all of us in the Jewish universe, and there doesn't appear to be any end in sight. And we have a really good guest on today for laying out, the domestic context of anti-Semitism and how it intersects with Hamas's act of terror and what is now transpiring in Israel. So let's just, as usual, go around. I would like to point out, though, that I got a haircut this week. I got one about an hour ago. I figured if I was going online and I forgot my hat at my ex-wife's house, then I needed to, actually get a haircut. So I did get a haircut. Aside from getting a haircut, I'm an associate professor of Jewish history at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. I hold the block chair, and along with Adam, I founded the Jewish Studies Zionist Network.
I'm Adam Fuller, and I also got a haircut. Not only that, but my dog just went to the groomers yesterday and also got a haircut. So yeah, we all have haircuts. So I'm Adam Fuller, and I am a political science professor at Youngstown State University, where I also direct the Judaic and Holocaust Studies Center. And also this morning, I became maybe the first Jew in history to help an evangelical pastor write his church sermon. He wanted
before having converted to Christianity. I mean, you got to lay that part out.
Yeah, that's an important qualifier. Yeah, and I won't be converting to Christianity.
So you're sure you're still Jewish, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Not that there's anything wrong with it.
I won't be converting. But no, he wanted to know more information about what's going on in Israel, and of course, I was happy to fill him in on whatever he wanted to know.
Okay, but you didn't eat any cookies or wafers while you were there?
Nothing like that. I wasn't even in person, right? It was over the phone.
Okay, you weren't eating any cookies while the conversation, because I think that's a de facto, baptism.
I wasn't.
Or host
no.
Communion. That's the word.
I was drinking a cup of coffee. I don't know if that counts or not. I don't think that counts as communion.
My Christian theology isn't deep enough to answer that question. But we have a guest here, and we shouldn't be holding up our conversation, ignoring the guest in the room. So we're going to stick to traditional protocol, and we are going to have the guest introduce himself, because Adam and I are too lazy to read CVs and stuff like that.
Not a problem. I'm David Bernstein. I'm the founder of an organization called the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, which pushes back against left-wing ideology in the Jewish world and tries to push back against it as well in the larger society. I'm a longtime Jewish advocate and professional. I was the last CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, which is the umbrella of all the Jewish community relations councils from around the United States. And I'm the author of this book, year-old book, almost exactly a year old, called Woke Antisemitism: How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. So that's who I am, and I'm glad to be with you guys.
Well, that's really terrific. I mean, we have certainly a lot to talk about. I will point out to our viewers, in case you don't know, there are actually 3 David Bernsteins floating around. A fourth if we include the drug dealer, the marijuana dealer, right? I plan on calling as soon as this recording is over.
I got his number, no problem.
Yeah. Okay, great. But the other 3 David Bernsteins are heavily involved in the universe of Jewish politics in a variety of different ways, and they often get confused. In fact, one of them is the editor or publisher, part of one of the executives at the publishing house where your book was published. Another one is a lawyer who is active in the circles that we swing in, who's a law professor, I should say. And I did watch a podcast once that consisted of all 3 of you.
Indeed.
Yeah, it was a very interesting experience. I got a little bit.
We're gonna have to get all 3 David Bernsteins on our podcast.
I was having trouble figuring out who was who while we were watching it, and I had to keep looking up names and who was doing what. It made for a very difficult, situation at a variety of points in time. But we have one of the David Bernsteins here, and that's what's most important. And we are going to, throw ourselves, right into the topic. We are going to talk about the, quote, events or the massacre in Israel that took place and how it is having ramifications not only over there, but over here, unfortunate ramifications, probably predictable, but at the same time, very, very disheartening. But I would like to talk a little bit about the book that you wrote, Woke Antisemitism, because it has evoked a little bit of controversy, especially among Jews on the left, who, probably haven't even opened it up, but have taken issue with the title in and of itself. So if you could tell us a little bit about the book, and about the title, certainly define the way you use the word woke. It's an incredibly controversial word for some people. I don't think there should be any controversy. In fact, I could think of one twerp on social media. He's blocked a few of the David Bernsteins, from what I understand, who has actually said, and I have the tweet somewhere, he said that anyone who uses the word woke is deliberately being racist against Black people, i.e. he's implying it's a substitution for using the N-word, which is...
But the term woke, though, was started by woke people in the first place.
Well, it came out of the African-American community, but it was then appropriated by the woke left, if you will, and they adopted it. And yeah, they are...
That's what I'm saying, is that it was not originally a pejorative.
That's right.
Consider it a pejorative because that's what we call them.
Yeah.
We're just using their term.
But we're going to let David talk, and we're going to let him explain here.
All right. So obviously it is a controversial word. The term was a little less controversial a year and a half ago when I wrote the book. It was still controversial. And I knew I was using a hot button term. John McWhorter just came out with his book, Woke Racism. So it obviously seemed like a smart thing to call my book, Woke Antisemitism. So what do I mean by the word woke? I mean, and I realize that other people are throwing it around kind of promiscuously. So it's been demeaned in that process to a large degree. I mean two things. One, that bias and prejudice and racism and oppression are not just a matter of one's personal attitudes, but they're ingrained in the very systems and structures of society. They're like in the air that we breathe. And the second one, which sometimes is called, you're professors, so you can take it, called standpoint epistemology, or the idea that only people with lived experience have the insight and the qualification to define oppression and racism and bigotry for the rest of us. And that second property is sometimes used to weaponize the first. So if you say, only I get to define racism, and you try to define it, you white person or whoever you are tries to define it, or you contradict me, or you think I'm wrong, or you cite data that's not what I would cite, then you are acting out of privilege. You are, or you're actually a racist, depending on the person who's saying it. And it's sort of the root cause of cancel culture. Because it says that only certain people can talk about these issues, and you're not one of them. And so if you did, then you're violating those norms. I want
to expand on that second point, though, the standpoint epistemology, because it doesn't just factor into when you talk about racism against a specific group. It isn't just about that. A lot of these communities, or at least the leftist activists within their communities, are now claiming that you can't even talk about them or write about them unless you've had the lived experience of being part of that collective. Even if the members of the collective have lived such disparate lives, where some of them are, upper class people living in the hills of California, and other ones are suffering in poverty on other parts of the United States. Everyone knows this, but
can I add one thing to this?
Sure, yeah.
I want to say this. That both of those observations can be true. Like, racism and anti-Semitism can be systemic. I mean, Jim Crow America was a pretty systemically racist place. Nazi Germany was a pretty anti-Semitic place. I think it would be proper to make that observation with a lot of confidence. And it is also true that that people with lived experience can have insight into things that we should all listen to. Look, you guys are Jewish, I'm Jewish. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, a few hours from where Adam teaches. And they used to throw coins at my feet, in middle school and high school, and swastikas in my books and what have you. Like, I have something to say about it. You might want to hear it. But again, you guys are Jews too. You might have a different thought about it than I do. Maybe your experience was different than mine. And there are data points that run in the opposite direction. So, the 2019 Pew survey that showed that American Jews are the most admired religious community in the United States. Like, I have to take that data point, not just my own lived experience, into account. And that's what this discourse tries to prevent that from happening.
Absolutely, but I was suggesting here that the entire enterprise of writing history is at stake here in many respects.
Yes.
It would be as if saying that I can only write Jewish history because I am Jewish. I can't write the history of any other peoples or states involving the peoples who live there unless they're Jews. And no one else should be writing Jewish history, except nobody says that because we all know Jews don't count unless they are Jewish. I was trained as a Russian and a Jewish historian. So am I no longer allowed to write Russian history because I am not an ethnic Russian? What if I want to write the history of Putinism and the people who support it? What if I want to get inside, the minds, if you will, of contemporary Russians? Am I not allowed to do it?
I think you can, because Russians are not a progressive, certified, marginalized community. And that's really the difference. Yeah. They're not capable of being harmed. And again, and there's you could argue that there's another dimension to this. It's sort of this new morality around harm, right? That if you're a marginalized community, you're a designated marginalized community, anything that people say that is not theirs to say is harming them, causing harm to them. So if they claim harm, then there must be harm, and therefore you must back off or apologize or otherwise be canceled. And so you hear that a lot. So it doesn't matter your intent in this moral paradigm. It's only the harm that matters.
Right.
And so yeah, you wouldn't have to worry. You can actually write about Putin all you want. You're okay. But if you specialize in some other area, you might get in trouble.
What if I wanted to do African American history and write something from their perspective, showing how much they suffered? I'm still not allowed to.
No, for sure not.
I also think there is something to be said for separation and impartiality.
Yeah.
That sometimes being an outsider might have, an advantage when you're studying something like this.
I agree with you 100%. And this occurred to me when I was an undergrad, and I was always into atrocity and stuff like that, which is why I guess I got into Russian history. And I understood that I would be able to study Stalinism in a way that I wouldn't be able to study the Holocaust, because I can leave all my biases out. My ancestors left Russia before the revolution. I have no family at stake when I look at the victims of mass starvation that Stalin inflicted on the peasantry or the people who were shot in 1937. I have a lot more difficulty, studying victims at Auschwitz and keeping my biases out. I mean, I do it since I ended up in Jewish history, but it's a very difficult thing to do. So I agree with you 100%. On the other hand, if you're inside the culture, you do have certain insights about the culture. And I know that my work, which is on Jewish humor, the fact that I grew up Jewish and, Seinfeld was a lived experience for me growing up, gives me a certain advantage in being able to write, about that.
Well, there's a place for both.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Culture and being an outsider.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, okay. So getting back to the book. Okay. So we've decided that wokeness here, as you defined it, is a problem, if only because it undermines critical inquiry, and it'll lead people who are not part of the group in question and getting canceled for allegedly saying things about minorities that they're not allowed to. But what does this have to do with the Jews in particular?
Yeah, so a couple things. One, Jews do much better in liberal societies than they do illiberal societies, right? So to the degree that this ideology corrupts sort of democratic liberal values, makes it hard for people to talk about to each other, rips our society apart at the seams, I think all of the above are true, then it is bad for us because we don't do well in those ideological environments. The second thing is that whenever you have an ideology that draws a stark division between oppressed and oppressors and links identity, you're black, you're oppressed, you're a woman, you're oppressed, you're white, you're an oppressor, in a very rigid way that can be true sometimes, but not as always true. It becomes dogma, and that dogma easily lends itself to anti-Semitism. It tends to conflate economic success with oppression. So if you take the Ibram X. Kendi how to be an anti-racist formula, that equity, which is the term that he uses, is when a group has proximate proportionality in a given field to its size in the population. So there should be 13% black scientists, or else there's racism and discrimination and oppression. So So the flip side of that, of course, is if you're a group that does better than average, like Jews, like Asian Americans and others, then you have to be, by definition, complicit in that oppression. Because what if that's the only explanation for why one group does better than another is oppression? Then that means that the groups who do better are the oppressors, and that's exactly how it tends to be weaponized. And so Jews, by virtue of their average financial wealth or their educational achievement, are part of the oppressive classes. I could go on. This has all kinds of implications, and you see like explicit ways of weaponizing it against Jews, like whiteness and so forth. So we can get into that.
This is the point I wanted to interject with, that 100%, but to do so also requires them to be implicated in whiteness, which is easy enough to do for Jews, because I know you're part Mizrahi Jew in origin, and you could say something about that afterwards. But Adam and I, we look white for all intents and purposes. A cop pulls us over, we'll pass for white. We won't have an issue with that. So whiteness is also a very important variable for them in measuring, the undeserved success that they want to impugn to the groups that belong to whiteness. The one hostile encounter I've had with someone on my campus, anti-Semitic encounter, which I've written up in the Jewish Journal. One of the things that she said, and it really stuck with me, that everyone knows that the Jews are the most successful white community. Meaning that any grievances I had that were anti-Semitic were irrelevant. Suddenly this was all about material success and nothing else.
Yes.
Now, here's the thing, though, because you mentioned Asian Americans. The whole premise of wokeness, or intersectionalist social justice, which is a term I like to use here, also intersects with a watered down version of critical race theory, where oppression is also linked to skin color. So it's very easy to lump the Jews into the group of the oppressor class, because we are, and it's true that in American history, legally speaking, we were defined as a white religious community, which carried.
I have a real problem.
Actually, my friend, wait a second, David E. Bernstein would strongly disagree with your historical observation.
Which one's the E? Is he the lawyer?
He is the legal scholar who just wrote a book called Classified. And he talks about it, and he said that actually that Jews and other ethnic communities like Italians and Irish were not originally classified as white, and only later became classified as white. But anyway,
as a historian, let me just put a corrective on that. We were basically white until the Russian Jews started coming over in the 1880s, and this is where the Italians and the Ukrainians and all them come in, and then we ended up being put into the category not quite white, and that we could work our way towards whiteness, as some scholars have argued. And yes, we were racialized in the early 20th century, and it carried forth through the Holocaust. And only then did we get grandfathered into whiteness again. But in the 19th century, the German Jews were basically treated as white people.
I don't understand, though. I mean, the whole purpose of the left, when it was first formed, the leftism, progressivism, is to deracialize everything, right?
Okay, but hold on, before we get there, I wanted to finish what I wanted to say. Now, given that skin color plays an important role here, you mentioned Asian Americans. Asian Americans are a visible minority, as are South Asians, who are doing exceedingly well. And you hear talk of Hindu supremacism now. How does the left square those two things? That whiteness is the gateway to success, and we have these Asian Americans and South Asians who are doing, incredibly well.
Yeah, so there are terms like brown complicity and white adjacency that
am I allowed to throw up on the air? Can I do that?
I know. I just as long as I'm not in the same room, I'm cool with it. I think that's how they do it. There are long articles about how white supremacists who are trying to advance anti-blackness have brought in other model minorities, as they would call it, to go and to use in their designs to hold Black people down. I mean, there's really crazy so-called scholarship out there about that. But yeah, that's the conception, is brown complicity.
I don't know. The woke left just seems to be wrapped up in stereotypes and tropes and blind assumptions about people simply because of their ethnicity or their gender or their race or their religion or whatever, that may or may not be true. In fact, studies have shown that colorblind conservatives like me actually do a lot better on implicit bias tests, because we treat everybody as individuals who have completely different experiences. some of their experience has to do with their race or their ethnicity or their religion or their gender or whatever, but not every element of their experience and their personality and the challenges they face in life are attributed to that. I mean,
Sure.
everybody has privilege to some degree, and everybody has a lack of privilege, at least in a free society, right? We all
Yeah.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, it
Go
doesn't mean that the concept of privilege is never useful. Like, I think, like, you know, if you were a white person living in, you know, the Jim Crow South, and you could go into the, you know, diner and, you know, get your sandwich, you could argue that, okay, that's a privilege that too, and it's a way, it's a flip side of the discrimination faced by Black people. It's a way of creating awareness in the people who are part of the system, that they actually are benefiting from it.
It depends. I mean, you know, there could be something about that white person that still makes them an outcast in the community.
Yeah, of course, that's the case. I'm just saying that I think it can be a useful concept. It's just abused. I mean, it's used. It's not that it's just not always true, and especially as America shifted and changed. We're not living in Jim Crow America. These issues become more complicated. Like, to what degree does racism explain disparity? To what degree are there other factors? You know, and how do we, you know, how do we have this discussion? Now, when you have this sort of wheel of intersectionality and privilege, and you assign everybody by virtue of their identity a binary, you know, power versus oppressed identity or valence, you're really just limiting our ability to talk about complex issues, and weaponizing against people who might have a different opinion than you. But I think Jews are very, yeah, go ahead.
When you put the Jews in general into this category of being the oppressors and the ones in power in our society, you know, you make all kinds of assumptions about Jews. I know Jews that live in dire poverty. I know Jews that, in fact, our family histories, I'm sure it might be the same for Jarrod, I don't know, but poverty, dire poverty on some parts of my family lineage, they were in dire poverty.
One of my grandfathers quit school when he was 12 years old to go shine shoes. He only got married, he said, a few years later because, quote, he didn't want to share a bed with his 3 brothers anymore. And he built up a successful textile company, even though the anti-Semitism in Quebec at the time was rampant. My other grandfather desperately wanted to be a university professor.
And not all
He
Jews
stayed out of university 1 year because he was $25 short. $25.
Not all Jews succeed either. Like, there are success stories and there are stories of unsuccess. I don't want to say failure, but non-success. And there's all kinds of Jewish humor sometimes likes to play around with some of these kind of tropes that have some degree of truth to it, like the joke about how you know, Jews never work on their own car, like they always take their car to a mechanic. I've always found that odd because in my family, like, my grandfather always worked on his own car.
But that's not about privilege. That's because ineptitude, because of the stereotypes.
I think it all traces back to the same thing, right? This idea that there's a commonality within our cultures, and that culture is a direct origin of our socioeconomic status.
No, see, but that's not how they look at it, Adam. I have to tell you, they look at it as your identity either gives you privilege or oppression. They're not looking at your cultural traits in that matrix. They just want to know where you are in the system, what the system has assigned you based on what your identity is. That's what they're looking for to get. So yeah, they probably said, of course, not all Jews are successful, but the system, because you're Jewish, or because and many of them, to be fair, won't say Jewish. They mean Jewish. Like, not all of them are going to be as explicit as that young woman that you heard in your school. A lot of them will say, well, I don't say Jewish privilege, I say white privilege, and because Jews are white passing and the system assigns white people's advantages, Jews have been able to take advantage of that white privilege. That's how most of them would say it. There's more extreme versions of this that, you know, that are more explicitly anti-Semitic, but that's how most of them would say it.
Yeah, no, I know, I agree. I agree with you completely. And where does this come from? Do you know the origins of it? Because look, I was in grad school at Berkeley in the late 90s, and postmodernism was all the rage. And postmodernism was allegedly deconstructing the Enlightenment, which was essentially a classification system. It was about how intellectuals beginning in the 1700s started assigning everyone into little boxes. And that's where scientific racism came from, of course. And, their whole decolonizing project meant eliminating that system. So you would think this would be the furthest thing from what they would want to do.
Yeah, sort of postmodern thought took a turn. In 1980s and 1990s, it became much more aggressive, much more activist. You can read about this in Cynical Theories by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. They really go into this, as does, by the way, Yashka Monk in his new book. I haven't read the book, but I've heard enough podcasts to have a sense of it. I'm just blanking on the title of it right now. But he wrote a new book also looking at these sort of ideological roots of this. And they very much, it's sort of, they stopped sort of the deconstruction, and they turned it into an activist agenda. A group of academics did. And I think that's what we've inherited. So in many ways, that's what wokeness, or if you want to call it radical social justice ideology or critical social justice, whatever you want to call it, I don't care, as long as we come up with a word for it and can describe it.
My words of choice are intersectionalist social justice, because they've taken the original concept of intersectionality and they've bastardized it by simply saying that all oppressions are linked. And if you're for one, if you're not against all oppressions, that means you have to be for one oppression. So as soon as the Jews advance their identity, that might consist of Israel, which we'll talk about in a minute, automatically they're part of the oppressor class. Though the way you've outlined it, clearly the issue with the Jews is not just Israel, it goes far beyond that.
But for the intersectionalism to work, though, Jews would have to be factored into that. Like we have a history of oppression. We have a reality of oppression is still in the world in many places.
Their selective choice of history. They're very selective in their choice of history.
Yeah, they're selective in their choice of history. They don't care about history. By the way, if Jews are successful today, it means that they've benefited from white supremacy. So even if once we were oppressed, we've today benefited from white supremacy. So therefore, we're not oppressed.
It's an American-centric presentist lens, which they then try to apply at other times in other places. Hence the bankruptcy of the 1619 Project, which is a piece of junk. I've read enough of it to say that. Taking the prism of race and just using it to claim that that's the motor that moved American history forward. Right? So, Black people have been oppressed in the United States. Therefore, that has to explain change in American history. And for Jews, we've been much better off in America than elsewhere. And even in that period of discrimination when we were racialized, they still couldn't pass laws against us, right? Because we were legally speaking white. They had to come out with all sorts of strategies to implement quotas in the university systems and all sorts of things like that. They couldn't simply say no Jews allowed as they did with racial minorities.
Right.
So let's turn to Israel now and everything that's going on there, because Zionism, for whatever reason, has become the centerpiece of woke ideology, at least for a very strong vocal corner of it, right? They seem to have centered the Palestinians as the universally oppressed in a way that the proletariat would have been in 19th century Marxist thought. And I'm trying to figure out how we exactly got there.
Yeah, well, in many ways, this emerges from Marxist thought, of course, in the late 1960s with Herbert Marcuse and the like. He's not a Marxist in a traditional sense. He wasn't looking for a violent overthrow. He didn't think that was even possible. He thought that the best you could do was evolve. And they had this concept of the long march through institutions. So when you take the long march through institutions and you take the Soviet anti-Zionist project that emerged in the post-Six Day War period, which tried to turn Zionism into, portrayed as a racist movement, you end up with sort of Zionism being at the center of the anti-colonial project, and that's why we are where we are today. And then you have the influence of Edward Said, and his version of postmodernism and Orientalism and so forth, a critique of Orientalism. So there's more than one crowd here. I think we should acknowledge that too. You have these really hardcore radical postmodernist ethnic study professors types. They have a tremendous amount of influence, so we should not downplay them. And then you have sort of more of the soft DEI people, the people who probably mean well. They don't really understand the implications of their ideology. You know, they see it as the next phase of the civil rights movement, and they see it as a kind of empathetic communication and cultural competency and so forth. They're not trying to overthrow the system. They're not going to call Israel, generally speaking, responsible for the murder of its own citizens. They're not going to do that. It's the former crowd that's doing that. So the ethnic studies professors and the teachers and the designers of curriculum in California schools, these are the people that do that. I mean, there's this group called the Coalition for Liberated Ethnic Studies. And I mean, the paint hadn't even dried on the New York Times description of the massacre when they were putting out memes on their Instagram account, you know, saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and, you know, portraying you know, Israel as a settler colonial state responsible for the murder of its own citizens. I have to say that as jaded as I am about these people, I was a bit surprised. I would have thought, if you asked me, what do I think they would respond in a situation like this? I would have said, I think that they'll say, yeah, that was horrible, but, you know, Israel had it coming, of course. But they didn't actually say that was horrible. They actually just all out supported the mass rape and baby murder, and put out all these memes that would justify that. So that caught me by surprise. Like, they were actually worse than I thought. I thought that at least they'd be more tactically and politically careful, but they weren't at all.
I think in general, we've seen this week, everyone is worse than we thought, and it's on a spectrum. So, you know, I mean, even
right.
Jewish studies programs, who you would think this would really be a wake-up call for them, they've been issuing basically all lives matters statements, you know,
yeah.
and which is utterly unacceptable at this point. It really
so
is.
That's the soft wokeism, and I'm not saying it's not bad. It's really bad. I mean, it's especially galling coming from Jewish studies professors. That basically leads to like the mealy-mouthed statements that come out of superintendents and, you know, university presidents and so forth. And I think, other than political factors, there's sort of this script that runs through their brains that goes something like this: Muslims are a marginalized community and can be harmed, so we don't want to harm Muslims. Jews are not a marginalized community, so and because that script, whether they recognize it or not, is going through their heads, they're much more circumspect about actually calling out murders like this. If a Jew had done what Goldstein did at the scale that Hamas just did to Israelis, they would have no problem condemning it in no uncertain terms, and that's because of that fundamental ideological strip.
Let me just also say that I completely agree with everything you both just said. I will say slightly in the defense of some of these all lives matter statements that have been put out by administrations. A lot of it, I think, is done to mitigate tension, to calm tensions on their campuses, right? To come out in favor of one side or the other and say this was horrible, but, you know, let's not even talk about that, might, you know, rouse anger on campus, and they want to make sure that that's not going to happen.
Well, what if they did that in June 2020? If they issued an all lives matter statement during the looting that was taking place, would that have gone over well?
Well, in that case, I don't think that there was a in that case there was just so much tremendous support for the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, and again, I'm not suggesting there shouldn't have been, but what I'm suggesting now is that we see this anti-Semitism coming out in full force. And with Jewish studies, you know, we wrote a statement about this and we named names. The Jewish studies.
No, I'm just saying that what happened the other day in Israel is very divisive on a college campus.
And do you think it's time that the Jews on these college campuses actually stand up for Jews? I mean, you do, because you're in.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the administrations and what they're thinking.
Okay, but what about the Jewish studies programs?
Absolutely. I mean, I helped you with our statement that we just put out from Jewish.
And I keep getting texts about typos, so you didn't read it very well, but that's another issue. Let me read the statement, very short, from the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies. This is UNC Chapel Hill. I'm at UNC Wilmington, so I'm not directly affiliated with them, but I've considered these people my colleagues, and I used to go up there all the time and do stuff with them. They wrote on their website, "We are heartbroken by the surge of violence in the Middle East," which could be Saudi Arabia for all we know. "And their thoughts are with all of you. Now more than ever, we very much hope you can join us in an upcoming community event, starting with our lecture on Monday, blah, blah, blah. Please take care of yourselves in this stressful time." I mean, how is this acceptable? I mean, for a Jewish studies program to say this?
Right. It's not, obviously. I will share some good news, is that some Jewish organizations have really been radicalized about what's happening. And I think that they've been far too careful, far too diplomatic, far too long. But the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington and the local ADL, faced with a mealy-mouthed statement from the superintendent of public schools in Montgomery County Public Schools, where there are 100,000 Jews, and my kids attended those schools. This is what they said. I want to contrast that with what we used to hear. "We reserve our greatest anger and disappointment for Montgomery County Public Schools. The senior management has consistently ignored our agency's urgent appeals over the last 3 days to respond appropriately and sensitively to the large Jewish community in the district, insisting instead that the principals alone should shoulder the burden of a public response. Meanwhile, Superintendent McKnight remained silent until the release of an inadequate statement last night. Our school system's refusal to honestly name the largest slaughter of Jews in history since the Holocaust is infuriating and disheartening to our entire community. A large number of local Jews have deep personal connections to Israel." So I'm just saying, like, I think that it's good to see some Jewish organizations and figures finally sort of standing up and saying what needs to be said.
Yeah, that's great. But, in our little realm, which is academia, nothing has changed. I mean,
Right.
I want the 2,800 people who signed the elephant in the room statement calling Israel a Jewish supremacist state funded by American Jewish billionaires to actually issue a statement. You know what? Maybe we were wrong. Maybe this is a little bit more complicated.
But at least,
by the way, I had this guy. One. Go ahead.
Yeah, we put pressure on AJS, and they revised their statement.
Yeah, that's true.
That's good. I got an email from one of my chief protagonists, not the tour, but a leftist Jewish guy from South Africa. We had a lot of back and forth emails, and I sort of just threw in the towel at some point. He emails me this morning: "Hope you are doing okay. It's clear that there is a radical left in North America that is aligning with Hamas. The firestorm of hatred is raging. Hamas is a death cult. Sad to say, you were right. Thanks for engaging with me. It helped me find moral clarity."
Well, that's great.
So
that's wonderful.
I wonder, and I'm not going to say that that's going to happen in your rarefied circles, but I wonder if that's not the direction we're going in. Like, that more and more people who would have called me on the carpet for just using the W word and would try to do everything they could to prevent me from speaking in their shul or their federation might not say, maybe Bernstein or Tanny or Fuller has a point here about some of these issues. I'm starting to think that the tide could change. And people see it now. How can you not see it? I mean, 30 student groups at Harvard signed that freaking solidarity statement. Where did it come from? Did it come from nowhere? Is it just some symptom? Like, all you're doing is talking about symptoms if you just condemn it, right? You're telling me that these mealy-mouthed statements from the superintendents and the university presidents come from nowhere? I'm saying that there's a whole ideological backdrop here, and we have to be able to talk about that, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it makes some of your donors uneasy, or even if it risks alienating some of your longstanding progressive allies.
Okay, but ideology doesn't exist in the vacuum. Who's propagating the ideology? They're learning it somewhere. They're getting it from their professors. Are they going into classes?
Yeah, I mean, this is a product of the university, of course, but then it escaped the lab and found its way into, it got bureaucratized by a DEI establishment that worked its way into corporate America, that captured certain non-governmental institutions, the Poetry Society, the Human Service Organization, the Philanthropic Foundation. They get completely overwhelmed by it and they shut down. They engage in what Matt Brunet calls identitarian deference. That this is really grows out of standpoint epistemology. This idea that we have to defer to people of a certain race, so they find carefully curated minority to be their DEI director and tell them what to think about these issues. And so now they're stuck. Like, these institutions are stuck. They're going to be very hard to change because they've signed on the dotted line of deference. And so I think there's not a lot of hope there in the immediate term, although, never know how the winds shift in the future. But I think that's where we are now.
Well, if there's going to be a ground invasion, I suspect after about 5 to 6 days of it, the anti-Israel statements from academia are going to come out in full force. I mean, we've just gotten little bits.
Yeah, some of them are biding their time till things settle, until the shift takes place, and they'll then see it as a political advantage. So I think that I think we've got to go to the Jewish community now and say, look, not gloat, by the way. It reminds me, by the way, of how the gay rights community, mostly, not all voices, came to basically say, okay, you agree with us now. Maybe your son came out and you're now with us. Fine, welcome, right? I think we've got to do some welcoming to our fellow Jews, not gloat, and say, look, I think you now understand that we have an ideological problem on the left that really needs to be addressed.
Yeah, anyone who signed one of those previous statements, if they decide that they were wrong and they want to join our network, I'll welcome them in. I'm not going to expect them to get out in public and participate in an auto da fe and burn themselves at the stake or anything. Absolutely. But you know what? I mean, look, you lived through the second intifada, presumably. I think I realized when they blew up that Passover Seder in Netanya, and there wasn't complete condemnation of what was not just Hamas, this was the PLO, and it was a general uprising of Palestinians at the time. The fact that there wasn't a mass condemnation of that, I realized, okay, that's it. The world does not like Jews, and this is not going anywhere.
I'm less optimistic than you are, though, judging from some of the pushback that we've already received. How dare we condemn Jewish studies professors? How dare we, call some of these people even close to being complicit in all this? Like, how dare we make these demands and expectations on the Jewish studies field and the Jewish community in any way?
They're losing. They're losing. I mean, look, I get it. They're not all going to come aboard. This could really soften. There's a lot of talk online, that from sort of anti-woke liberals who are wondering if this might be the straw that broke the camel's back, that getting the Jewish community so angry about this and getting so many, let's say, wealthy trustees of major universities to push back. And maybe you get critical mass at that point. It's not going to all happen next week or next month, but maybe it starts. More and more people are so angry that they can no longer be silent. They're not going to sit down and wait around anymore. They're going to understand intuitively that, having all these ridiculous academic departments that indoctrinate people is a problem, and we're not going to stand for it anymore.
So, as you just suggested, change. Hold on. Change is going to come from donors and outsiders who are going to press the university. It's not going to come from within. I can't see.
I agree. I agree with that. And all of a sudden, it won't be just Chris Rufo or whatever. Not that I don't always agree with him. I disagree with him frequently, but it won't be just those activist types now that everybody can point to. It's going to be a much larger set of people that start to push back. And I think maybe some universities start to liberalize over time. I think we're already seeing that, by the way. You have my alma mater, Ohio State, announced it as a new program. I don't remember what it was called exactly. That was going to be, intellectually open, as if, there should be some.
Well, you can't discount the influence of Arab community centers either, pushing back on it from the other side. And so a lot of administrations have they're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, but again, the role of Qatari money, especially, like how long, the Qataris are going to come under incredible heat, which is exactly what happened to Saudi Arabia after 9/11 and led to Saudi Arabia and the Saudi kingdom, king and crown prince to sever their ties with the sort of Wahhabi activist crowd. And not entirely, I'm sure, but Saudi Arabia really changed. Like, it wasn't, Saudi Arabia is not funding radical academic programs anymore. It's Qatar that's doing that. So maybe this is the 9/11 moment for Qatar. Like, okay, either you're going to be in the good graces of the United States of America, or you're going to continue to fund crazy people on our campuses. But I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of scrutiny here And if what I've seen is that a lot of these programs really can trace back to Qatari money.
It's a big problem because, I mean, again, it seems at the end of the day, this is coming down to money to a certain extent, right? You have them on one side, and then you've got the more conservative donors on the other who are finally waking up to what's going on. So, I mean, if we're going to get any change, it's going to have to be financially. It's going to have to be pressure from people who have money, or pressure on people with money. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a little bit sad.
Yeah, it is, but I'm a little bit more hopeful than I've been in a long time because of that. And the political calculus shifts too. I mean, at some point, like these programs are exposed, and if they're exposed and they have scrutiny, and more people are starting to ask tough questions, I think it becomes harder for them to sort of side with the radicals.
I hope so. I mean, that sounds very optimistic, but thus far, the response that we are seeing is less hopeful. Now, again, there have been university administrators, not Jewish studies programs, who have issued, great statements. And, even though they do have their, we fear for all lives, they have their opening paragraph condemning Hamas outright. So as long as they do that, if they want to go on and saying, we weep for everyone who gets killed on whatever side they're on, as long as they get in that opening statement that, hey, we know who started this, right? And it's been the worst massacre since the Holocaust, and this needs to be addressed, then great.
Exactly.
Yeah, but very few Jewish studies programs have done that. And they have done
that is really incredible. That is really incredible to see. I don't know if they're all part of your network now, but I know a lot of the older old timers within Jewish studies and Jewish history professors and the like. And when I talk to them, they're just so dejected at what's happened in their field. Like they've been vilified themselves, and just just can't believe how much ground they lost so quickly to such stupid people. I mean, I know that's probably politically incorrect, but
they are stupid. I've met them. I've been on panels with them. I've discussed them. And yes, I mean, Jewish studies is it's a very big field, right? And so it's not like we're talking about just historians. We're talking about people in religious studies. We're talking about people in communications and ethnic studies and these other
even political science.
And of course, political science. But these people who are in ethnic studies or whatever and wanting to study the Jews, they're bringing their bogus ideological crap. They've got no proper training in any methodology of a real academic discipline. I'm going to be a history snob here, because I am properly trained as an academic through the methodology of a discipline that's existed for hundreds of years. As has Adam, though I don't really have much respect for political scientists, but I won't go there now. But these other people, do you speak any foreign languages? Have you even studied Hebrew since you were in elementary school and you're in Jewish studies? Do you know Yiddish? Have you studied the culture of the shtetl in the 1700s? What can you tell us beyond what's going on with Jews in the United States and their complicity in white supremacy? And so many of them just simply don't have the training or the knowledge to deal with anything outside of their very, very limited scope.
I believe that, based on what I've seen and some of the so-called scholarship that's come out of the field recently, and what you're telling me about the tone and tenor of the response to Israel, which is really astounding. By the way, I don't know if have you written an op-ed specifically about? I know you wrote in the statement, but I can't wait to read your op-ed about that too.
About this latest thing?
About how Jewish studies programs couldn't muster a proper condemnation. I'd start off by saying, you thought that university presidents and superintendents were bad. Just wait till you see what Jewish studies programs had to say.
Yeah, I have to. Yeah, I probably will write something eventually. Though I did take our statement and I reposted it on my Times of Israel blog that I have, because I suspect my blog gets more hits than our network page does at the moment. It also comes up higher in Google searches. So I put in a little intro here, saying why I'm reposting it here, verbatim, and I ended up publishing it there as well. But at a certain point, and it's really sad, at a certain point, I'm sort of saying the same thing over and over again.
Weren't you thinking about writing a sequel to your Jewish Studies You Are Lost article?
Jewish Studies You Have Failed. Yeah, Jewish Studies You Are Beyond Redemption. Yeah, that's. Yeah, I'm. You know what? I'm waiting for a couple of weeks here to see what transpires, because I have no doubt that the hostility towards Israel is going to increase dramatically if there is a ground invasion, and once that happens, I want to see how Jewish Studies is going to respond, and they're probably not going to be defending Israel at all. they're probably going to be focusing on civilian casualties in Gaza and legitimizing what the anti-Zionists, the left.
Do you think there might be fewer people signing that statement than, say, the Operation Guardian of the Walls statement a few years ago?
Was that the May 21 statement?
Yeah.
We will see. The elephant in the room got over how many signatures? 2,000.
Yeah, but that was before the Hamas attacks.
It was. But that statement had anti-Semitic tropes in it that were worse than the one in the May 21 statement, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, granted, that was a very interesting statement because on the one hand, it started out being directed very, what we're talking about, right, David? The elephant in the room. That statement from the opening was directed at Israel's current government, right? They weren't making any larger claims about the Jewish state, unlike the May 2021 statement, which said that Israel was built on, racial or Jewish supremacist ideologies stemming from the Enlightenment's scientific racism. That's essentially what they said. So
they got a lot of liberal Zionists signing that statement too.
The May 21, yeah, that was the wake-up call, I think, for everyone.
Not May 21, but the elephant in the room.
Well, yeah, see, that's the thing, because it didn't start out attacking the entire, Israel project,
Right.
The entire Zionist project. It was clearly directed at the current government, and there's a lot of bad things that can be said about the current government. And they even said in there, 1 state, 2 states, we don't care. It has to end now. Well, they're leaving open the possibility of a 2-state solution. But then they got into the whole Jewish supremacy, funded by American billionaires crap, which is
It's almost as if a lot of them didn't even continue to read beyond the first couple of paragraphs.
Well, people have a very short attention span, and as we suggested in our very first episode with that film Israelism, most people are going to consume it by looking at the poster and watching the 1.5-minute trailer. They're not actually going to see through the movie or sit through the movie or stay awake through the movie. So yeah, they do have a limited attention span. Maybe they didn't see that. But on the other hand, I still firmly believe there is an anti-Semitic current in Western civilization that has never disappeared, right? And it's there. It's always there in the background. And when they see phrases like Jewish supremacy or wealthy, American Jewish billionaires, it triggers something in their minds, right? Even if they're not anti-Semitic, in public, there is some sort of unconscious bias, if you will, against the Jews in Western civilization. And saying stuff like that, Jews saying stuff like that, basically not only triggers it and evokes it in public, but it legitimizes it as well. And therein lies a massive problem. I don't know. What happens all depends on what Israel does in the next few weeks, I think. But otherwise, I think Jewish studies is going to hold the line with what they've said thus far, which is very, very few condemnations. We'll give a shout out to the University of Florida.
Ben Sass.
What?
Ben Sass.
Who's the president? I saw that too.
Yeah.
Who is Ben Sass?
Ben Sass was a former senator who's the president of Florida, and it was a marvelous statement. Yeah,
and the Jewish Studies program directed by Professor Norman Goda, who my former mentor, who gave me my first job at Ohio University. He's director of the Jewish Studies program there. He issued an incredible statement. 2 days after it happened, it was just out there. And really, that's exactly what I wanted to see from other Jewish studies programs in the country. But they didn't. So we had to write a statement ourselves, and we had to name names. There was just simply no way around it. So as we finish up, David, I want to ask you one last question here, which does pertain to the Jews indirectly here. Actually, it's more than indirectly. But DEI, I don't think it's going away anytime soon on college campuses. And there's a big debate as to whether Jews or Jewish activists, Zionist Jewish activists, should be working with DEI offices to explain why this is an intrinsic part of Jewish identity. And when you talk about, quote, diversity, you need to take the Jews into account. On some campuses, I believe that is the case. On most campuses, it is not. Do you think it's better to work within the system, or we need to tear down the whole system?
Yeah, this is the dilemma. And I have to tell you, I go back and forth a little bit in my own mind about how we should best navigate it. I have something called the crazy test when it comes to DEI. And this is what I will tell people when they ask me. How crazy is the DEI program? If it's a lot crazy, don't work with it. Then you're just trying to slot anti-Semitism into as some category of oppression, which is ridiculous, of course. And not that it can't be oppression, but anti-Semitism has its own unique properties and shouldn't be understood in that ridiculous way. So a lot of times, if they're talking about white supremacy culture and that kind of thing, I would run the other direction and condemn the framework. I mean, if there was a framework that was trying to indoctrinate everybody into like the Great Replacement theory, we wouldn't sit there and be saying, well, as long as it's not anti-Semitic, we're okay with it. But we're going to condemn it, right? Because we know where that goes. Yeah. And so I think if it's that extreme, I would. If it's what I would call like soft DEI, there's a little bit of goofy stuff in it, and they talk about equity, but they don't talk about it in this no uncertain terms. I think then, maybe it's not going to be me, of course, but maybe Jewish groups should try to influence the way that anti-Semitism is presented in that framework. A lot of times DEI programs at a corporation aren't just some like training. They're different sessions, and they're offered sort of based on your interests. So you could do your own session on anti-Semitism, for example. I'd do that, no problem at all. And I know a lawyer who helped sponsor a program like that in a major law firm. It wasn't like they were trying to slot it into somebody else's worldview. They were just presenting anti-Semitism as they understood it. So that's how I think of it. I subject it to the crazy test.
I think for a lot of administrations, though, this is just really performative. They say, okay, this is the way the wind is blowing now, so we have to get on board with it. And so long as the wind is blowing in that direction, they will do it, which means it's implemented incredibly simplistically and poorly. And, you have to go through your bullshit training videos and whatnot. But at the end of the day, are they actually following through with what they're doing? Maybe they are, maybe they're not. But at the same time, they're actually subjecting people to it.
And sometimes it gets used. Look, I don't know if you've ever gone through those like sexual harassment trainings. If you actually work in New York, or you work for an organization that's based in New York, you have to go through their sexual harassment training, and they have a whole thing about harm. It's the harm that counts, not the intent. And when the New York Times was decided not to fire their science reporter who had quoted somebody else using the N-word. And by the way, they're really top science reporter. I can't remember his name all of a sudden. The 150 times staffer said, "You told us it's the harm that matters, not the intent." Like, so sometimes we tend to like dismiss these things as, well, they're quote unquote harmless, right? They're harmless. No, they're harmful in a very different way than these ideologues are using the term harm.
I just, this reminds me of the training I guess it was harassment training that we had to do at my university. I'm going back about 7 or 8 years, so this is the pre-DEI era. The first example or the first video in what we had to watch was actually about anti-Semitism. And it was about this, I think they worked for some sort of medical company, it wasn't clear, but this guy who worked for the company decided to, play a joke on the one Jewish employee there, and it was around Christmas time. And what did he do? He set up a nativity scene on his desk. And then another employee, this woman, comes up to him and said, "How could you be doing this? Don't you know that Ira is Jewish?" And they said, "Of course, I do. That's why I'm doing it." And but you can't, that's offensive to him. He said, "Oh, it's a little bit of a joke. And why aren't we having a Christmas party this year? It must be because of him. He must have said something that it's discriminatory against the Jews." So, but the funniest thing about that video, aside from the fact that, if you're going to freak out because someone sets up a nativity scene on your desk, I mean, you really have to take a step back and think about things. But the funny thing about it, though, was, the Gentile in it was this tall, strapping, muscular guy, and the Jewish guy was this short, little, dumpy guy named Ira. Okay, his name was actually Ira. Okay, I mean, the video reinforced every possible stereotype that you can imagine. And I'm sitting here watching this saying, like, this is me being trained, to not be bigoted. So
did he work on his own car, or did he take it to a mechanic?
I don't even know if he could have dismantled the nativity scene that was on his desk. Yeah, so it was a joke. And again, I think a lot of this stuff is really performative. That's being managed by people who are making incredibly low salaries that don't have proper education in such matters. That's my opinion on that. So
I'm not sure that they're making incredibly low salaries. Some of these DEI people, by the way, are making really big money.
Really? Yeah, I guess it depends on the university. So I mean, that the fact that from the administration's point of view, much of it is performative, and they're going to go whichever way the wind blows. That gives me hope that will go away eventually, that this is just the latest fad. And then eventually they're going to move on to something else, which
they're going to get sued too. By the way, the affirmative action decision of the Supreme Court lends credence to the idea that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prevented you from discriminating against white people. In other words, race was the protected category, not blackness. And because of that, you're going to see more and more court cases that follow suit, people suing their universities and their places of employment. Already you have legal counsel in a lot of these places saying we can't do those affinity groups anymore, for example. And so I do think that there's going to be a very powerful legal tool to disrupt some of these DEI programs.
Yeah, and I'm happy there, at least from the Jewish perspective, that there are, you know, legal organizations and lawyers involved in fighting against anti-Semitism by using the courts and whatnot. And, you know, I'm a big fan of Ken Marcus for having, you know, worked, you know, with the Trump regime, even though I am sure the guy is not a Trumpist, to get that anti-Semitic executive order passed. And then once he got it passed, he left the administration. I mean, that's an example of Jews working within the existing system. And Jews have been great at doing that, at least going back to Tsarist Russia, if not earlier. And they certainly did it in the United States when they faced discrimination in the early 20th century.
Yeah. I know we're going to have to end, but, you know, there is a flip side of that, of course, is you could say that about ethnic studies in California. So you had all the Jewish organizations saying, well, as long as the ethnic studies program doesn't specifically call out Jews, we'll support it. So they'll pay the price of admission into the discussion around ethnic studies, which is we'll support your teaching settler colonialism as long as it doesn't say that Israel's a settler colonial state. And I think that's a problem.
It is.
Now, you know,
I agree.
You know, and that's the bargain that I don't want the Jewish community to make in order to be at the table, you know.
That framework should not be taught in high schools whatsoever. It would be like coming, because everything is simplified. Learn about it in the graduate seminar if you want to learn about critical race theory. Don't bring it into the high schools. That's what they would do in the Soviet Union. It would be like bringing Marxism and saying you can only understand history through this lens. That's what they're doing with critical race theory. And I will not get on board with that whatsoever.
Me too. Thank you.
Well, I think we've neared the hour mark. We've probably gone a few minutes over. This was a really, really terrific session, and I'm looking forward to posting this as soon as we come up with a title. Though I have a few ideas already percolating in my head. So I thank you, David Bernstein, number one. I'll call you number one since you're the first one who has been on our show, and you're also, as far as I know, the first one who was blocked by the twerp, and that's a badge of honor in and of itself.
Exactly.
So thank you so much for giving your time. Your book, and I will praise the book. I think it's a terrific book, and I assigned part of it, excerpts of it, for my class on anti-Semitism last year. Though it was the last week of the semester, I have a feeling they didn't read any of it. But I'll have to get it on the syllabus earlier next time around.
Invite me to your class. I'd love to talk to it at some point.
Okay, for sure.
Okay.
All right. So this is Jarrod Tanny signing off. Say goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Take care. Good night.